one of our advisory board members and a good friend of mine. We've known each other for quite a long period of time. It's Nick Burbridge. And Nick, former OSFI official. He's been a FATF evaluator. He works with a bank today. And we want to talk to Nick about a whole host of things regarding basically the Canadian AML infrastructure and then some additional questions. So first of all, Nick, thanks for taking the time today. I really appreciate your sharing some of your thoughts and insight today. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, John. It's great to see you again.
So let's start with when you left OSFI. At that time, obviously, from the AML perspective, OSFI had a specific role, and you were involved in a lot of the programming that we did at ACAMS and other places to talk about what you and your staff saw in terms of challenges and deficiencies. But when you left, the OSFI role changed a bit, and obviously FinTRAC is a main overseer now as well. Tell the audience a bit that aren't as familiar with Canadian AML infrastructure, the differences now between OSFI and FinTRAC, and then we'll talk a bit about, you were kind enough to share with me a speech from Kathy Thompson last week, who's the assistant superintendent, about a change yet again. So if you don't mind talking about some of those items.
Sure. Well, when I was at OSFI, what got me into this business was the need for the FinTRAC people to be able to start looking at compliance, because FinTRAC had and still has official responsibility for ensuring compliance with the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is our AML legislation. And so with the blessing of my then boss, I developed a supervisory methodology which blended together elements of prudential supervision, which OSFI has been doing for many years, with these requirements with respect to AML. And so we ran that out firstly as a pilot program and then launched it full time. Later on in the process, after about 5 or 7 or 8 years, I guess it was, FinTRAC decided that it now had sufficient knowledge and wanted to proceed to take on the compliance function itself. And initially it was decided that it would be done in partnership with us. In other words, we would, instead of just having OSFI go on site, there would be FinTRAC people there as well. But it became apparent after some time that the main issue here was in running such a joint scheme was twofold. Firstly, we at OSFI felt that we needed statutory authority to blend these two remits together, if you will, and so that, and my suggestion was that OSFI look at all the prudential elements as we had been doing, and FinTRAC focus on the enforcement side. But that wasn't accepted, and OSFI and FinTRAC began sending more and more people to supervisory visits. By the time I retired, which was in spring of 2017, there had been 2 or 3 years worth of discussions with finance as to how this situation could be improved without any real resolution of the issue. And I suppose, I'm not sure, but my retirement may have triggered an eventual decision by OSFI to vacate the business and to hand it all over to FinTRAC. And that in fact did occur about 2 or 3 years ago. My principal concern with FinTRAC as an AML regulator is the fact that they do not have, and never can really have, the depth and breadth of knowledge of the banking sector that a prudential regulator like OSFI has. And if you look around the world, it doesn't take you long to realize that having an agency that is not actively involved in banking supervision is not a great idea when it comes to AML supervision. We, unfortunately, followed the Australian model where they had, because the two countries, Australia and Canada, are very similar from a structural point of view.
Right.
So we followed their blueprint. And there's really at the time, I was involved with the FATF. There's no real involvement by the prudential regulators in Australia at all. Now, there may be now, but at the time there was not. And so I couldn't understand this, particularly since FATF requires that the standard of supervision in the banking sector be equivalent to core principles supervision, which is Basel standard of supervision. In any event, in the meantime, so OSFI is now out of this game, and in fact, it repealed its guidance a couple of years ago, formally repealed it. But in the meantime, the government has now decided that with international developments being what they are, someone needs to be looking out for security and integrity of the financial sector. And that role apparently is now being given to OSFI. So that's a change. And that in turn has led them to the conclusion that they will have a role in AML supervision. But there have been press interviews and other communications to the sector which clearly indicate that OSFI needs to be a little bit more specific as to how it intends to execute this in practice, because they call it a supervisory role, yet they will not be looking at AML processes and systems per se. So as a former supervisor, I'm struggling to understand how you can have a supervisory role in AML without looking at AML. I mean, that's just me. So that is a situation which will unfold. The universe is still unfolding on that part of the program. In the meantime, I joined a bank, as you rightly said, and it gave me an opportunity to see how banks actually look. It gave me an opportunity for a detailed review of the systems. When I was at OSFI, I looked at all of the banks, but not in the level of detail that you would expect if you were on the board of directors. Sure. And there are a lot of moving parts that banks, particularly a bank like ours, has to struggle with, where it's owned by a foreign bank. In my case, it's owned by a bank in Korea. So there's a lot of expectations on the part of management, and we spend a lot of time talking about how to implement some of these measures and what the regulators are looking for now. And we've recently, my bank has recently had its 2-year audit, and we've focused in on the areas that we think are the most important. And I've encouraged them to pay very, very close attention to what FinTRAC is doing today, to look at the areas that FinTRAC is looking at, because what they're doing, they appear to be executing some sort of a thematic approach to these. FinTRAC is this, where they're looking, for example, at the real estate sector, and so they're looking at banks' involvement in real estate transactions, which for banks basically is the mortgage business. Right. And so we've recently had a review on that, but yeah, it's been an interesting transition, and I'm not backward about coming forward when I think that there are still issues. And I'm actually speaking at a conference in Victoria later this year on the topic of supervision, AML supervision.
Look, going back to your comments about OSFI and FinTRAC, pulling up the speech from Kathy Thompson last week, I'm just going to reference a couple of things and get your reaction. It sounds like that you're saying that as OSFI begins to reestablish itself in the AML field to some degree, it's not, as you say from public comments, it's not specific enough, and sort of the proof is in the pudding, if you can use that old hack phrase. But a couple of things that she says. She says OSFI is collaborating with its counterparts to tackle AML. So what does that mean, right? And then she says here, if we suspect or see evidence of money laundering or terrorist financing, we engage FinTRAC in accordance with, as she says, respective statutory authorities. And then she says, we closely supervise implementation of measures to ensure the institution's compliance. And finally, OSFI has legislative power to intervene in the operations of an FI if warranted to do so. So it sounds like she's being a little more specific in the speech than perhaps the press stories are. Maybe this is the wrong word, but are you more comforted that there's a potential that OSFI is going to be more engaged with what you clearly see as some of the challenges that FinTRAC has had over time? They have more staff now, but as you said early on, they're not as familiar with the workings of an institution as they probably need to be in order to make sure that the AML programs and policies are sufficient. So does that give you any more comfort from some of the specifics, or like I said, you have to see what happens?
Well, I think what you've just referenced gives me a little bit of extra comfort, in as much as somebody has thought through the process of OSFI's powers, existing powers, and whether they can be applied and whether they should be able to be applied in this space. And clearly that is now on the table. So that's good. However, there was an article in the local business press this week in which a person from OSFI is quoted as saying about their role, and here's what they said. Quote, OSFI's role is, where necessary, to translate FinTRAC's findings into supervisory activities aimed at ensuring FERFIs, that's federally regulated financial institutions, have policies and procedures in place to protect themselves from threats to their integrity and security. Now, that's the threats to the integrity and security. That's the new element of the mandate that I was talking about.
Right.
But how that translates into being able to rely on FinTRAC's findings gives me a sense of discomfort, because, as I said, I'm not entirely convinced that FinTRAC's level of expertise in the banking sector, particularly in the big banks.
Right.
When Canada looked at the big banks, when I was at OSFI, it was clear to me that the big banks together as a group were responsible for probably 80% of the risk or thereabouts in the private sector in Canada. That's across federal and provincial financial institutions. So I recommended to Finance Canada that the big banks, the big six banks, which we call in Canada the domestically strategically important banks, DSIBs, they should be looked at as a group separately. Now, FinTRAC has, in a way, responded to that by treating them separately as a group. I think probably more administratively, but I don't know how well they have learned. I don't know how far or how they've gone up on any learning curve with respect to those operations. We were virtually looking at those big six banks all the time on an ongoing basis. Excuse me. So that's the worry I have if this quote in the press is accurate. Taking FinTRAC's findings as a starting point could be problematic if those findings are not well founded or not based upon very, very well understood knowledge of the banking sector.
No, that certainly makes sense. Let me ask you the specifics in Canada of filing suspicious reports. The phrase is reasonable grounds to file. You and I talked about this offline. In the States, because the banking industry, because we were all part of it back then, were successful in putting into the statutes and the regulations in the U.S. that if you filed a suspicious activity report, there was no liability to the bank if they did it voluntarily or they did it based on a regulation. Those same parameters, as I understand it, don't exist in Canada. So what are the challenges for the reasonable grounds to file? And I know there's been some enforcement actions in that space, but talk a little bit about that, Nick, based on both your experience when you're at OSFI and since then and being a FATF evaluator. How would you compare the U.S. system, besides what I've just said, between the filing of SARS and suspicious reports here and there? What's your take on that?
Yeah, the two systems are subtly different. In the U.S. system, is based upon what I would refer to as suspicious activity. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. Whereas the Canadian system is specifically focused on financial transactions. In other words, for a STR to be filed, a financial transaction has to occur.
Right.
So if you're suspicious about a customer because of their behavior or because of some other factor, then that suspicion should be recorded because it could eventually contribute to the filing of an STR, but it doesn't trigger necessarily an STR. What triggers the STR is the occasion of a financial transaction. You're right about the safe harbor, and I think it boils down to the fact that some banks, and in particular the high-profile banks that we've read about as being the subject of very large fines by FinTRAC, have do not appear to have done enough work in concluding that what they have is in fact, and I don't want to correct you, John, but far from it, but reasonable. It's reasonable grounds to suspect.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Perfect.
Reasonable grounds to suspect that the transaction is connected to a money laundering or terrorist financing. So you have to be able to put out on in an analysis information which clearly indicates that it is reasonable for you to suspect that this is probably connected to, or I should take out the word probably, it is reasonable to conclude that you are now suspicious that this is connected to a crime. You're not required to know what the crime may be.
Sure.
You're simply required to determine whether you have reasonable grounds to suspect. And this is where some of these banks appear to have tripped themselves up. Now, the inverse is also the case. You could file not having reasonable grounds to suspect as on a defensive basis. And you could be picked up by FinTRAC for that as well. In other words, FinTRAC could conclude, well, the STR does not, on its face, contain any indication as to why you're suspicious. That is very common, and it may be less common today than it used to be. But
so that criticism, I hate to interrupt, that criticism is very common in the past, at least. The FinTRAC would come back at the institution and say, you actually should not have filed that. That's really interesting.
They not only did they say it to individual banks, but they said it at conferences. I mean, one of their big beefs was that they were getting STRs with the old form had a so-called Part G, in which you had to set out why you were suspicious. And it was full of phraseology like, well, client usually deals in Canadian dollars. This is a US dollar transaction, so that's suspicious. Like, hello, it's not suspicious. Right. Or this person usually does his banking in Calgary, and here he is in Toronto doing banking transactions. Well, it's a free country. We can move around, right? So things like that were put in as being suspicious. They may have been unusual, even odd, but they weren't necessarily suspicious. So that's the challenge. Okay. What I have said to our bank is, you've got to decide if you've got reasonable grounds to suspect. But if you decide that either you do or that you don't, you've got to make sure that you've got a detailed record as to why you are suspicious or why you are not suspicious, so that you can set this in front of the regulator when they come, and that's based upon what they are currently now appear to be doing, which is looking at STR filings. The reason that FinTRAC is looking at STR filings is that they say, and they've made no secret of this fact, that they've always been an intelligence-driven agency. Their main purpose in life is gathering financial intelligence on bad guys. That's what they were built for, and that's what their main goal is. They were also given enforcement. I think that in the long term, that's turned out to be not a good idea. That we should be looking at other countries' models. And the one I have, when I was in office, looked at personally twice and recommended to my colleagues in Ottawa, it was the Spanish system, where the prudential regulator, which is the Bank of Spain, has a clearly defined and articulated statutory role in AML supervision and is able to communicate its findings to SEBLEC, the official enforcer. They have a model similar to Canada in terms of the institutional arrangements, but they have fully levered all of their agencies into a very, very effective regime. If you look at Spain's fourth round FATF report,
Right.
it's very good. I participated in that evaluation, and they have a very good system because they haven't worried about ideology and the old sort of the high priests of prudential supervision not wanting to get into AML supervision. All that stuff went out the window. They have focused in on a very, very pragmatic way of getting at financial crime, and it's worked. And that's the model that I would think that Canada should best be following. But you don't have to look far around the G20 for other countries. Your own country, the US, fully levers the federal prudential regulators in this fight. The United Kingdom has done in the past. Germany has made BaFin, which is the bank prudential regulator, fully responsible for the entire financial sector. So I mean, there are only very few countries that do not fully lever off the knowledge and authorities of their prudential regulators.
I wasn't prepared to ask this, but given what you've just said, it does trigger a thought in my mind, and that is
Sure.
One of the criticisms in the States has been sort of the three-legged stool of AML. So it's the private sector, it's law enforcement, and it's prudential regulators. and part of the reason for the challenge or complaint has been, while we understand, we meaning the financial sector, private sector, why you need prudential regulators to assess programs and policies and operations and all of that, they're looking for something uniquely different in terms of AML than law enforcement. Law enforcement, as you said, like with FinTRAC, they want the data, they want the information. So what happens is, and I'm going to use this as the critique, although I don't say it happens frequently or not frequently, leave that for others. So if the regulators are criticizing the bank's policy regarding filing and other things, that's sort of a different angle than whether the information is getting in efficiently, correctly, and all of that. And so there's a feeling that because of that different charge, that sometimes the regulators in our country look at things that might be considered sort of check the box and maybe not relevant to the end game. And so I think that's where, but I understand your point that the prudential regulator understands how the institutions work, so they're in a much better position to assess is the process of filing, reporting, and recording. But I do think that's, and you're right, obviously most of these other countries have that system, but that has been a criticism in the States. And in fact, in the recent law that passed a couple of years ago, there's a section in there on training the regulators, because there's a view, right or wrong, that the regulators, while they are trained, maybe are not trained to better understand what this infrastructure is supposed to find out, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think what you just said triggered a thought that I had thought about earlier, but should mention now, and that is that when OSFI rolled out its initial AML methodology, started supervising financial institutions, it was before FinTRAC acquired the power to apply enforcement penalties. When enforcement penalties came along, which was at the beginning of 2008 or 2009, I think it was the beginning of 2009, we were asked if we were going to apply these penalties, and we said, well, this authority goes to FinTRAC, not to us. Mm-hmm. And the question came up as to whether or not what actions, if any, we were going to take. And I told somebody at a press conference sometime that we fully shared information on our findings with FinTRAC, and it was up to them to decide what information would go into the basis for determining a penalty. Mm-hmm. And we've stayed away in particular from STR filings. And my teams did not get it. All we did was made sure that it seemed reasonable, that where they had information that they had filed, that the information looked reasonable. It was pretty easy to find STRs that were filed defensively, and we pointed this out to the banks. But we never got into the he said, she said discussion of whether you should or should not have filed. We left all that to FinTRAC, and I can remember telling FinTRAC that is a lose-lose situation, because it's always going to be, well, that was our view, and well, you should not have had that view, and so I didn't want to get into that, particularly in those early days. In the early days, we were trying to get banks to do basic things, like trying to explain to them that if they were only lending money, that was a transaction. There were institutions who did not believe that loan accounts were subject to the Proceeds of Crime Act. I mean, it was that basic. And so we spent a lot of our time just examining the infrastructure, if you will, and what it applied to and who was doing what, and whether you were capable of gathering enough information to come to a conclusion about suspicion. We didn't want to start second guessing what the actual decisions were, because we figured that was not part of our remit.
And that's a big part of the debate that goes on in the States, is second guessing of filing. Let me get you out of here on this. We could talk another hour about this topic, but if you wouldn't mind, just a few minutes. You've been an active member of FATF, an evaluator for many, many years. Give us the good, bad, and challenges of FATF. I think almost all of us believe it's extremely valuable organization, produces excellent content. The evaluation process has been improved. But as somebody who has sat through a number of those over time, give us your sense of how you think since 1989 to today, how FATF has evolved, and what are some of the things that strike you about that?
Well, some of the things that have struck me since we talked about this the other day, and you indicated that you wanted to talk about the FATF. So I'm not on the FATF files every day, so, as you can imagine.
Sure. Right.
But nevertheless, I've done a little bit of homework, and I actually found a few things that raised my eyebrows. The first thing is that compared to what things were like when I was in the FATF, things have changed, I think, quite dramatically in a number of ways. The first is that you've got two members of the FATF at the present time that are currently on the FATF's grey list. Now, back in the day, I can remember Turkey being on and then getting off again, and I can remember Argentina being on and getting off again. And it was a big deal that an FATF member was on the grey list. And now you've got two. You've got Turkey is back again, and you've got South Africa also on the grey list. Moreover, you've now got another member of the FATF whose conduct internationally has been now so egregious that it's been suspended from the FATF. I'm talking about Russia. Right. So you've got three members of the FATF who are in deep caca with the FATF. You've got further another country who historically has wanted to join the FATF for many years, but can't, because it can't get itself to the point where its processes would be acceptable, and that's Nigeria. It's been off. I guess the carrot and stick process hasn't been working. But I remember lots of discussions about the fact that South Africa is the only African country in the FATF, and that Nigeria had done a lot of work. But Nigeria can't get to the point where it qualifies on, like 3 or 4 basic levels to membership. At one point, when I was still involved with the FATF, Nigeria, I think, and Indonesia were sort of almost neck and neck, and it was Indonesia that made the grade. Mm-hmm. So the other thing is the blacklist. Or the grey list. Well, the blacklist hasn't changed for a long time. The grey list, however, is something that I think the FATF needs to do a little bit of more thinking about, and maybe they are. I don't. Clearly, I'm out of this loop on the FATF. But in reviewing why a number of countries are on the current grey list, you got, and I just took two and compared them, two extremes, if you like. The two I looked at were Croatia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, clearly with Croatia, there's a whole laundry list of things that they need to be working on. And they're set out in the FATF's reasons for putting them on the grey list. With the Congo, there's 2 or 3 things. You might initially think to yourself, well, can we sort these out on the basis of how many strikes the FATF listed in the listing? If there are 6 strikes for Croatia and 3 for Congo, surely the Congo is doing a lot better than Croatia, but that's not the case at all, because you've got to read all the words, and the words against the Congo are essentially, when you read through between the lines, they haven't got a system. They've done diddly squat. So there could be a better way of communicating to the rest of the world why you need to be concerned about those countries. And because right now, say, for example, Canada just says, Congo's on the list. Be careful with anything to do with Congo. Worse that effect. But there may be some areas where there may not be any heightened risk at all. For example, if you're dealing with a Congolese citizen in Canada, what is the risk?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he's got a Congo passport?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. Now, he may be doing business back in the Congo. There may be other reasons, but the fact that he's simply a Congolese citizen may not necessarily be an issue. There are all kinds of other issues, and there are with the FATF, including some systemic issues, which I've never understood why they haven't come to the surface more. One is the sort of golden passport issue, where even some countries like Malta and Cyprus, have been able to issue passports to Russian oligarchs to avoid sanctions against Russians.
Well, they just did a report on that. So as we talked about the other day, so they're finally identifying that to some degree. Yeah.
So I think that the FATF could usefully, but I mean, I think overall, the published results of the 4th round, and in particular, the utility of the fact that those ratings that they have brought out have now been updated, where countries have gone, or regular countries have gone back and say, okay, well, we fixed this issue, and we'd like to be re-rated on this particular area, and so the FATF has now a processing to do that, and then officially changes the ratings. That is a better indicator, or at least it's better than in the past, because it gives the financial sector more up-to-date information about what the particular issues are in a particular country.
Oh, that's great. Nick, thank you so much for your time. I do want to give you a chance. Do you want to leave one takeaway to our friends in the AML community now that you've been in the private and the public sector? One thing that you've learned many things over your career, I'm sure, but one thing you want to let folks know about today before we close this down.
Sure. I continue in my belief that at its heart, the work is fascinating. It's very important. I wish I'd gotten into it 20 years earlier. Right. For those of you who are in it now and you want a great job with the FATF, the deputy executive secretary position at the FATF is currently open, and I'd be applying for that job if I was 20 years younger. But if you want a great job in this field, joining the FATF would be a fantastic opportunity. That said, I'm still enjoying the work periodically, not done yet, so looking forward to the next challenge whenever it comes around the corner.
Nick, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. You've been so helpful over your career, and we'll be back in touch, I'm sure. Thanks so much.
Good to hear from you, John. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.